Here's Nancy. She's on already. Hey!
Calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson calling Rick Beyer in Chicago.
Hey, Chris. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. It's not raining and it's kind of nice out. So, yeah, doing
We want to welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, and we'll wait a moment for people to join us to get started for real. And please post something to let us know you're here, and post something to say happy birthday to Chris Anderson. What are you, 30 today?
I
20,
am.
25 or 30? Something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
So we're here talking about history every Sunday at 4 p.m. on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours Facebook and YouTube pages. And, of course, all of our broadcasts are also archived on the History Happy Hour webpage. So you can look back on previous shows all there. And we have a bunch of folks joining us today, and the crowd builds.
Yeah.
And so, Birthday Boy, can I call you Birthday Boy?
Yeah, anything you want, Rick.
Okay, very good. I think as we're hitting a critical number here, we can get started. We don't want to delay too long. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. And the bar is open.
The bar is open.
The decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima was probably the most consequential and controversial decision of the 20th century. And even today, 75 years later, debate continues over whether it was the right one. Should the bomb have been dropped? Was there an alternate path that would have changed post-war history for the better? Our guest today, Chris Wallace, has tackled the story of the bomb in a new book called Countdown 1945, The Extraordinary Story of the Atomic Bomb and 116 Days, The 116 Days That Changed the World. And the book, written with Mitch Weiss, deals with the debate over dropping the bomb, the actual mission, its impact on the world, and it encompasses the president and his advisors, scientists, generals, the flight crew, and many, many other people caught up in this drama. And of course, Chris Wallace is a longtime television reporter and interviewer, the host of Fox News Sunday, and the winner of more prestigious journalism awards than we have time to list in this show. Chris, welcome to History Happy Hour.
I'm delighted to be with you guys. I have to say, that introduction, I think you blew your whole production budget on that. That was very impressive.
There you go. He's digging for that.
Wow, praise is. Listen, I am totally. Praise gets you everywhere with me, Chris. So flattery totally wins the day. Listen, you're a journalist. Why does a journalist who is deeply enmeshed and involved in reporting the issues of today decide to write a history book, and why this one?
Well, the interesting thing is that I found 1945 and the decision to drop the bomb in the midst of World War II just a warm bath, a relaxation. The thing that I always say is that in researching this book and writing this book and now talking about this book, it has nothing to do with Donald Trump. And I don't mean that, I know that's going to sound like he hates Trump. I don't. But I'm worn out by Trump. And to go back to 1945 and several things, the process by which Truman made the decision, and more importantly, the unity of the country at that time. Everybody was pulling together. Everyone wanted to do their part. Just one little fact. 125,000 people by the end were working on the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Hanford, Washington, and Wendover, Utah, and not one word of it ever broke. And, I can't help but feel that today, if there was a project with that number of people to create a new recipe for apple pie, that there would be a whistleblower on day 2 who would say, this is outrageous, we have to do something about it. In terms of the subject, really the concept came first, and that was that I wanted to do a deep dive on a particular subject. There's a book I very much admire, and I recommend to other people. Jay Winnick, great historian, wrote a book called April 1865, which I was fascinated by, because he took the first 2 weeks in April of that enormously important year the Confederates surrender to Grant at Appomattox. Truman makes a major speech about the Emancipation Amendment, and then he's assassinated. So it's 2 weeks. But in doing this deep dive, he told it almost in real time. And so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to tell a history story in real time to give you the sense not of, oh, we know what happened, now why did it happen or how did it happen, but how it felt at the time it was happening. I didn't have the subject, though. I knew what the concept, but I didn't have the specific piece of history. So in 2019, on the day that Donald Trump was going to deliver his State of the Union address, a few of the TV news anchors were invited over for a pre-buttal by Speaker Pelosi. And this is a uniquely Washington thing. Republican speakers do it for Democratic presidents. Democratic speakers do it for Republican presidents, opposite party. And they give a pre-buttal. And the pre-buttal is basically to tell you everything that's wrong with what the president is going to say about 4 or 5 hours from then before he has even said it. So in the course of this conversation with several anchors in Nancy Pelosi's hideaway, she mentioned that this was the Board of Education, which I was very excited about. It was the room that Sam Rayburn used when he was speaker back in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And he used to have people come down to gossip, to plot strategy, to give them marching orders. They'd drink bourbon and branch water. They call it the Board of Education. But what she specifically said was that it was in this room in April of 1945 that Truman had gotten the call from the White House to come back immediately to the White House. And he hung up the phone. This is Pelosi telling this story. He hung up the phone and he said, "Jesus Christ and General Jackson." And I thought, that's it. That's my story. And so for the rest of the night, I was thinking about the 33rd president of the United States, not the 45th president of the United States.
So it's kind of ironic that in being inspired by the decision to drop the bomb and one of the most momentous decisions of the 20th century, that you can find some relaxation in that.
Well, that's what I say. Yeah, because you would think, and it was fraught with obviously tension and uncertainty and the enormous stakes. First of all, human, but also geopolitical. But, it was so, in a sense, divorced from the everyday of covering Washington in the year 2019, which is when I started working on the book, that I found it very relaxing. And the way that Truman made the decision, I hope we'll get into that a little bit more. And again, the unity of the country was such a departure and such a refreshing change from what it is I cover every week on Fox News Sunday.
I bet. So now we'll get into, there are lots of different topics I want to touch on, but one of the things that's drawn me to history ever since I was a youngster is you just find these compelling stories like you did in this case, and you talk about this being a historical thriller. Is there a day that, of all the days, the 116 days you talk about, is there a day you just say to yourself sometimes, God, I wish I was in the room?
Oh, lots of days. 2 days stand out right away. The first is the first day, April 12th, 1945. Truman has been vice president for 82 days, very much an afterthought. The only reason that the Democratic Party chieftains wanted him on the ticket, literally, is because they wanted Henry Wallace, who was the sitting vice president, out because they thought he was too far to the left. And frankly, a lot of people, a surprising number of people, thought that Roosevelt was so sick that he wasn't going to survive his fourth term. They didn't know he was going to be gone in 2 months, or 3 months, but they didn't think he was going to survive the term, and they wanted somebody more mainstream. But the main reason they wanted Truman is they looked around and they said he would hurt the ticket the least. Not that he was some big, exciting new guy, but everybody else had some negatives, and he was enough of a kind of non-entity. Only 2% in a Gallup poll supported him for vice president, that he would hurt the ticket the least. Anyway, he's in the Senate presiding over a very boring debate over a water treaty with Mexico. The session ends at 5 o'clock. He goes over, as he likes to, as I say, to Sam Rayburn's Board of Education, He gets this phone call. The interesting thing, and again, this, it just gives you a sense how much simpler life was in Washington in the 75 years ago. He has slipped his Secret Service detail when he leaves the Senate, walks across the Capitol by himself to the House side, ends up in the Board of Education, gets the call, and now he has to, and the call just says to him, it's nothing about Roosevelt being dead. It's simply, Mr. Vice President, you need to get back to the White House as quickly and quietly as possible. He thought he was going back to meet with Roosevelt. He runs back across the Capitol by himself. Again, no Secret Service protection detail with him. His footsteps echoing off the marble floors, walking past these empty corridors with the statues of statesmen and generals, gets to his vice president's office, gets his hat, gets his driver, again slips his Secret Service detail, Tom Hardy, his driver, and they go to the White House. He gets there, and he knew that Roosevelt had gone to Warm Springs, Georgia, to rest up after his trip to Yalta. He'd been exhausted by it, but he thinks somehow he's come back, and he had only had 2 private meetings with Roosevelt during his entire time as vice president, 82 days. So he's a little bit on edge. What's this about? He goes upstairs. He's ushered up to the family quarters. He thinks he's going to meet with Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt comes to meet him. He's dressed in black. She says, Harry, the president is dead. He thought he'd gone there to talk to the president. Now he finds out he is the president. He goes, he says to Eleanor Roosevelt, is there anything I can do for you? And she says, is there anything we can do for you, because you're the one in trouble now? Anyway, so now they have to get the cabinet there. They have to get the Chief Justice, Harlan Stone. He has to call his wife, Bess, and daughter. Oh, you got a good picture there. That's great. That's exactly where it happens, in the cabinet room. And those are all members of the cabinet and congressional officials. You can see Sam Rayburn right behind the Harlan Stone, and that's Bess Truman. The interesting thing is, they couldn't even find a Bible. And they finally found a Gideon Bible in the desk of the chief usher at the White House. They then give it to Truman, and Harlan Stone, Harry S. Truman, he thinks the S stands for ship, which is a family name on his father's side. And he says, do you, Harry, ship Truman? And Truman has to correct him and say, I, Harry S. Truman, because as we all know, the S stood for nothing. And then if you saw, go back, can you go back to that picture again?
Yes, I can.
Okay, go.
Provided by your crack PR team there, by the way. So.
Oh, good. All right. Well, if you look, you'll notice that he's holding, not Bess, he's holding the Bible in his left hand, and he has his right hand on top of the Bible. So after he takes the oath, Stone, the Chief Justice, says, well, no, you got to put your right hand up to swear the oath. So now he has to take the oath a second time. Harry S. Truman takes the oath, says, to the cabinet, look, I want you all to stay on. I want you all to do what you were doing for Roosevelt. And then Henry Stimson, the 77-year-old Secretary of War, this was he had served 5 presidents. Truman was about to be his 6th, brings him into a private room and says, Mr. President, I need to tell you about a project of immense scale to build the most powerful weapon in history. That is literally the first time that Harry Truman had ever heard about the Manhattan Project. He'd been, as I say, vice president 82 days. Neither Roosevelt nor anybody else in the cabinet had seen fit to even tell him about the existence of his project. Then Stimson says, look, I know you got a lot on your plate, so I'm going to come back after you've settled in. And in fact, he ends up coming back 13 days later, April 25th, to brief him on the Manhattan Project. And it doesn't seem like Truman was particularly, consumed with what is this secret project.
That
he
seems
has damn much to do.
Seems kind of weird to wait 13 days. You might think if it's the most important, a weapon, one of them might have thought maybe 1 or 2 days would be a better choice.
Well, it worked out, and he was really not prepared to be president at all. He had to settle in. He had to continue. He had to take over as commander-in-chief. Remember, the war in Germany was still going on. And in addition to all the other things on his plate. And there's another reason he didn't need to tell him right away. The bomb had never been tested. And so there was really nothing he could do at this point.
Right.
The project was underway, but the bomb wasn't tested until July 16th, which was exactly 3 weeks before it was dropped on Hiroshima.
Well, I'm sure it must have been even when that is first presented to him. I mean, it's going to even be hard to imagine, right?
Yeah.
What they I mean, how if somebody said, "I've got something so big that he could not even have conceived of," I don't know. I mean, how do you deliver that sort of news to poor Mr. Truman?
Well, and what happens is that on April 25th, 13 days later, Stimson comes in, and then Major Leslie Groves, who was the commanding officer of the Manhattan Project, he is snuck into the Oval Office a back way through some tunnels because they don't want anybody in the press corps or anybody else. I mean, this is so closely held to think, what are Stimson and Groves doing together? And they tell him about the project, and he has trouble comprehending it. They give him a pretty detailed memo on it. I think it was 20 or 25 pages, and they ask him to read it, and they're reading alongside him with it. And he complains. He says, "This is so complicated and so technical." And Grove says to him, "Mr. President, this is a complicated project. We can't explain it to you any quicker than this."
Yeah.
Chris, the Harry Truman's decision making is a central part of your story, and I should say for the audience that there are many other parts to it. I don't want people to think that's all there is, because you really are weaving. I knew there was a W word there someplace. All of these different parts of the story together. But I think that this is kind of to me, reading it, it was the central theme of the book. And although Truman later was like, "I never had any doubts, this was always what I was going to do," it's a pretty agonizing decision. He says at one point about the bomb in his private musings, it may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark. So how does he wrestle with this decision?
You know, it's interesting because you said before that there's so many interesting nuggets. And when you get the idea, and, this is the first history book I've written, so I didn't know a lot about it. But, when you get the idea, all right, I'm going to do a countdown, and I'm going to take people through the days from, April 12th when he becomes president, and coincidentally that same day learns about the Manhattan Project, to August 6th when he drops the bomb. That's about all I knew. I had a little knowledge of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, but there's so many wonderful and juicy details that come up as you delve into this. I mean, for instance, who knew? Obviously, a lot of people knew. I didn't know that he didn't know about the bomb, and he finds out about it the very first day.
Yeah.
But there's so many things that come out, and one of the joys of writing a history that's somewhat removed is you have access to people's memoirs and people's diaries. And Truman actually was a very faithful diarist. One of the first things I did when I started researching the project, along with my co-writer Mitch Weiss, was I went to the Truman Library. I've been to presidential libraries, but always in the front of seeing the exhibits. I'd never been back in the archives, and to get access to his diaries during those 116 days were so wonderful. One of the things that I thought I knew about Truman, to get directly to your point, was he was famously decisive. The buck stopped here. He never second-guessed a decision he made. But in fact, and I think quite appropriately, he agonized over this decision. He held meeting after meeting, and he was by the time he was making the final decision to go, he was in Potsdam, Germany, a suburb of Berlin, for a Big Three meeting. Now, the Big Three, of course, had been Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Now the Big Three was Churchill, Stalin. Oh, this is fantastic. And Harry Truman. And there they are in front of the Sicilian Palace in Potsdam. And so he's now filling Roosevelt's shoes, rather large shoes, and feeling, frankly, according to his diary, somewhat inadequate to the task, somewhat nervous about whether or not he could play that role and develop the relationship that Roosevelt had developed as a war ally with Churchill and Stalin. And he's complaining about not being able to sleep. He complains about searing headaches, which he had throughout his career, throughout his life, whenever he was under extreme pressure. And yes, indeed, in his diary, he compares it to the fire destruction in the Bible, and repeatedly calls it the most terrible weapon. I was tremendously impressed that he really did agonize over it. Now, after he dropped the bomb, and I looked and read what he wrote at the time, what he wrote later in his presidency, what he wrote in his post-presidency, what he said to the famed obituary writer Alden Whitman of the New York Times. He never once expressed any second thoughts about dropping the bomb. And in his diary, one of the things he says at one point, because the projections that the military are giving them, that there could be 250,000 to 500,000 American casualties, maybe as many Allied British casualties, and 1 million Japanese casualties if they invaded. And that's the big point. It wasn't drop the bomb or don't drop the bomb. It was drop the bomb or invade Japan, which was going to make the war go on for at least another year, maybe a year and a half. And at one point in his diary, he writes, "I think the flower of American youth is worth a couple of Japanese cities." So he in the end, it was a kind of calculated decision. There are a lot of people going to die. This is going to be brutal, but we're in a war, and this will save tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of American lives. Rick, we can't hear you.
Yeah, no, I muted myself to avoid.
He very rarely does that.
Construction noises. Yes, it happens once a show at this point. So it's an exciting thing for all of our viewers. I wanted to, before I go to you, Chris Anderson, quick follow up with Chris Wallace on that. Do you think, your opinion, was there ever a chance really that they weren't going to drop the bomb after hundreds of thousands of people and hundreds of millions of dollars had been spent on it, that it wasn't going to get used? Was there any possibility of there being an alternate history?
I know it's a very good question. Obviously, one I thought about a lot. I don't go in much depth into the morality of it. People can read and make their own judgment about it. I do go a lot in sort of the practicality of it. And, think about this. Roosevelt approves and gives the green light to the Manhattan Project in 1942. As I say, by the end, 125,000 people were working on it. $2 billion was spent, which was real money in those days. You have scientists working away at Los Alamos to see whether they can even make this. This was an absolute breakthrough in scientific technology. And up until they tested it on July 16th at Alamogordo, they didn't know whether it was going to work. So there were a lot of questions. So now imagine all of that, and what you're being told by George Marshall, who was the general of the army, is we're going to need 760. This is the number that sticks in my head because it's so precise and oddly precise. 766,700 troops you're going to need to carry out the invasion. It's going to take probably till November of 1946. We're now in the summer of 1945. And if you go ahead with the invasion, as I say, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of Americans, maybe 1 million Japanese. What person would have sat there and said, you know what, I'm going to carry out this war. It may kill more people, but it'll be a conventional war, rather than use this weapon, which by July 16th he knew would work, because of my sense of morality. I mean, the idea that 2 months, 6 months, a year from then, as the war is still going on, the word leaks, and I think it clearly would have, that he did have this weapon and he decided not to use it. That's kind of an impossible decision for any president to make. Now, having said that, on July 20th, just at the time that he was deciding to use it, Truman had lunch with General the head of the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, Dwight Eisenhower, and Omar Bradley. And at lunch, Ike told him, I don't think you should use it. I think that the Japanese are about to surrender, and I think that you will shock the world, and it'll really hurt our moral standing in the world. And I will say throughout his presidency, and even after, Ike said in his position he wouldn't have used it. I wonder about that. He didn't have to make the decision.
No, yeah.
In any case, all I'm saying is, I think it's a very good question you asked, Rick. And in the end, I find it hard to believe that any president would have said, no, we're going to just fight, and hundreds of thousands of people are going to die, and World War II will continue for another year and a half because I don't want to drop the bomb.
Yeah, I we'll get to Eric's question in a second here, but I got to say, I knew several members of the Enola Gay crew. I've studied this. I lead tours to the Pacific. I've yet to meet or encounter anything where any of the principal players involved in this said, yeah, gee, I wasn't really quite sure about it. Or, I think they were all it was a difficult decision, but they were comfortable with it after they'd made it.
I gotta, I'm going to flip this around. I'm an interviewer. Who did you know? I mean, I'm fascinated by what you just sort of passed off. Who did you know from the Enola Gay?
Well, I knew Tibbets pretty well because I was the editor many years ago. I was the editor for World War II magazine, so we would talk, and I remember at one conversation we were having at an air show, and as people do, they came up to him and they said, Colonel Tibbets, you did this thing and you had this mission and so many people died and was terrible, and how did it affect you? And he just looked at the person and very matter-of-factly said, I've never lost a night's sleep in my life.
No, that's exactly, you heard it from the horse's mouth. I've read what he has said, and all the members of the crew have said, and what Truman has said. There is one person in particular. Let me just back up for a second. One of the things that, you talked earlier on about a history thriller, and that's very much what I was hoping to achieve here. And in fact, one of the reviews in the Washington Post said, I know what happened in 1945, but this book reads like a thriller, because the fact is on April 25th or June 18th or July 16th, they didn't know what was going to happen. Right. The scientists didn't know whether they were going to make, whether the gadget, as they called it, would actually detonate and go off. The flight crew, when they took off on August 6th, had no idea, because they had never seen the bomb and had no idea what it would be like. It was detonated on a 100-foot tower. It wasn't dropped. They had no idea when it was dropped and detonated in midair about 1,800 feet off the ground in Hiroshima. They had no idea what the impact would be, and frankly, whether or not the aftershocks would blow the Enola Gay right out of the sky. So there was a tremendous tension and suspense, and we're trying to tell that. But the scientists, even before the fact, some of the scientists began to have second thoughts and about what they were developing. And in fact, there was a petition drive to Roosevelt and then subsequently to Truman before the bomb was dropped. Don't do it. One of my favorite stories, again, this is one of those nuggets that you don't know as you get in, but you discover. So the bomb was dropped on August 6th. In October, a couple of months later, Robert Oppenheimer, who is the scientific architect of the Manhattan Project, comes to the Oval Office. Oh my gosh, you guys are so, that's Robert Oppenheimer, and there is Leslie Groves, and they were the odd couple, because Groves, his big, burly bulldozer of a guy on the right there, he was the man who, his previous job is he had led the effort to build the Pentagon in about a year, the biggest building in history at that point. And Oppenheimer was the scientific director of the project. And so Groves was creating all of these military deadlines, and Oppenheimer was trying to get these scientists, who Groves considered a bunch of prima donnas, to work. At one point, Groves said, I feel like I'm conducting a ballet because of all the prima donnas on the scientific side. In any case, in October of 45, Oppenheimer goes to the Oval Office to meet with Truman. And by that point, he's really racked with regrets. And he says, Mr. President, I have such terrible doubts. I feel I have blood on my hands. And Truman has no interest in this. And he says, don't worry about it. The blood is on my hands. And he can't wait to get him out of there. And as soon as he does, he says to his staff, I never want to see that son of a bitch in this office ever again.
Wow. I want to remind everybody that we are speaking to Chris Wallace, who's the author of Countdown 1945, The Extraordinary Story of the Atomic Bomb, and the 116 Days That Changed the World. That's as oddly a specific number of days, Chris, as is the estimate of troops for the invasion of Japan.
Well, George Marshall's a pretty specific kind of guy.
I know. We have a few questions that have come in from our audience, so I want to bring in one here from Eric. And put it up there, who asks, why do you think Japan didn't surrender after the fire bombings of Tokyo, but did after the atomic bombs? It's my understanding the firebombing created more destruction.
That's a very good question, and he's exactly right. The firebombing of Tokyo killed 100,000 people, which was more than was killed in both of the bombings. You know, this is one of a sidelight of this question, Eric, I get a lot, which is why, you know, as I mentioned, Eisenhower thought they were about to surrender anyway. You know, I just think the story, the history, the facts indicate that's not the case, because what happens is on August 6th, they drop the bomb on Hiroshima, and the hard-line military government in Tokyo refuses to surrender. Then, 3 days later, because they had two bombs at that point, they dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki, and it's even more destructive. The second bomb was a plutonium bomb, and again, the military government refuses to surrender, and it was Emperor Hirohito who went over the heads of the military government in Tokyo and did a direct radio broadcast to the people of Japan, and basically said, you know, this is a level of destruction that we've never anticipated, and we need to surrender. And it was, you know, it took not one but two bombs, two atomic bombs, and a level, as I say, of destruction never foreseen, let alone, you know, actually experienced in human history, to get the Japanese to surrender. And it was still over the objections of the government.
And of course, we don't have to get into it here, but we've actually talked about it on the show before. The second bombing run was a horror show with
everything
with disasters from the beginning to the end. It very possibly could have failed completely, and we could have been dealing with that situation where there was only one bomb and not another one to drop. But I want to bring in another question from our audience, and this one is from Ross. Was there any real understanding of the long-term effects at the time? I would assume not. And as you're thinking about that, Chris, I would add to that that's sort of what surprised me a little bit reading your book. Maybe people didn't understand, or maybe they did, the long-term health effects, but there was widespread understanding that this wasn't just another weapon. This was letting the genie out of the bottle.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask whether you think Ross meant health effects or geopolitical effects. In terms of health effects, they obviously, because it hadn't happened, they didn't have a full sense, but they certainly were aware of the possibility that of radiation, and that could have real effects. The flight crew was concerned about that. People that witnessed the only test bombing at Alamogordo were certainly aware of that. The geopolitical effects, sure. I mean, you see with Eisenhower wondering whether or not it would, the genie that would be unleashed from the bottle, and what effect that would have down the line. I'm often asked, why do you think that only these two bombs were dropped and no bombs were ever dropped after? And it really relates to this, because I think the reason that we felt safe dropping the bomb then was because we were the only people who had the bomb.
Yeah.
And in 1949, when the Russians developed a bomb, that now you couldn't drop the atom bomb. No single country could drop it with impunity, because it was obviously the concern that the other side might drop a bomb on you. So I think that was it ended up at a much bigger scale in the 50s and 60s and right really through the 80s, being the doctrine that had prevented a nuclear war, which was MAD, M-A-D, mutual assured destruction. If we drop a bomb on one country, they or their ally will drop a bomb on us. So that nuclear balance of terror kept the missiles, the silos, and the planes carrying the bombs on the runway.
Yeah. So one of the Rick, am I jumping the gun, Rick, or?
No, Chris, it's all you, baby.
Well, one of the characters that I was particularly interested in was a man named Lawrence, the reporter, because he's obviously a gifted journalist, but he's kind of secreted away and told, you're going to be given the biggest story ever, but you're going to go undercover and nobody's going to know you're there. Say goodbye to your wife. Write the story, but no, it's a very interesting kind of side part to the book. But he said, one of the quotes that I really liked was, he says, in its design, talking about the Manhattan Project, in its design went millions of man hours of what is without a doubt the most concentrated intellectual effort in history. And it certainly must have seemed so at the time. But I was just kind of would like to get your thoughts, whether you think that that's still the case.
I certainly, if it's not the top, it's certainly in the running. There were Nobel laureates all over Los Alamos. It was an extraordinary assemblage of talent. Got to remember that one of the ways he wasn't involved in it because he wasn't given a security clearance. The initial idea for the Manhattan Project, it wasn't, as I say, okayed by Roosevelt till 1942, but in 1939, Albert Einstein writes a letter to Roosevelt and says, "Look, there's there is this technology potentially out there, splitting an atom bomb and using the power of that chain reaction to create, a completely unforeseen, unprecedented explosive. And you ought to get working on it because I think the Germans are probably going to be working on it." And so that certainly piqued Roosevelt's interest, although he really didn't get going in a serious operational way on the Manhattan Project, as I say, until 1942. And that was primarily because Churchill pushed him to do it. And I think Churchill had more of a sense of what the scientific efforts were in Germany to create the same bomb. I just want to go back to William Lawrence because this speaks again to why this 1945 was such a vacation from 2019 and 2020. So William Lawrence is a Pulitzer Prize winning science reporter for the New York Times. And in April of 45, Groves realizes that this project, if it is ever used, and also everything that's been put into it, is going to be a hell of a story, and a story that I suspect, one, he wants it to be told right, but two, he probably wants some measure of control over. So he walks into the offices of the New York Times, meets with the editor, and without really telling him, says, "Look, I need your best science reporter." And I think Groves knew already about William Lawrence. And so Lawrence comes in and he says, "I can't tell you what this project is, but you're going to be detached from the Times. You're going to come in. You're going to, be embedded." A phrase he didn't use that, but that's a phrase we now know. No, you'll be embedded with the project, and you can't write a word until I give you permission to write it, but you can do all the research. Now, in all of the things that you can think of, all the questions that may have raised in a reporter's mind, Lawrence asks only one question: will I have total access? And he is told by Groves, yes, you will. And in fact, he was given total access. And interestingly enough, so he is embedded. He's at Los Alamos. He ends up on Tinian Island with the flight crews. He ends up on the second flight, the one that dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. I mean, he is there for the dropping of the second bomb. So he was along for the ride. And one of the things was the scientists, not surprisingly, including Oppenheimer, were very skeptical about whether a mere journalist could really understand all of these highfalutin scientific technological concepts. So at one point, he asks Oppenheimer a question, and Oppenheimer kind of goes, "Well, it's really too complicated." And Lawrence says, "Well, let me tell you what I understand. And he proceeds to tell him in such a clear, understandable way that Oppenheimer kind of goes, this guy's pretty good. Incidentally, the phrase "the atomic age," William Lawrence.
So Chris, I want to follow up with a couple of questions on Lawrence, who I was also fascinated by, and obviously there's a comparison because he, like you, is a journalist. So if a general walks into Fox News tomorrow with a similar story for you, or walks into the New York Times, or walks into any place these days, what are the odds of somebody saying yes to that?
None, zero. It just wouldn't happen.
It's a different time.
I'm not saying that, yes, it's a different world. The level of trust between the government and the media, it just wouldn't happen today. And I think it's too bad because, he told a hell of a story, and we would have missed a lot of it if he hadn't been there for the ride. But this again goes back to why reading and researching and writing about 1945 was such a delight, because it was so different.
Well, but the other thing that was really interesting about your Lawrence story is then after the fact, and probably more like around 2000, there were a bunch of journalists. He won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the atomic bomb, and a bunch of journalists who wanted to say, no, take that away from him because he was a puppet of the military and the government, and so he therefore contributed to the cover-up of the real damage and nastiness of the atomic bomb for a long time. So, kind of interesting, epilogue to that story.
Yes, well, there's epilogue to the epilogue. So you're exactly right. Lawrence passed away, and at some point, a group of journalists said, well, he wasn't really a journalist. He was a government employee because he was on the payroll of the government. He wrote press releases from the government in addition to doing this independent reporting. Obviously, everything that he wrote had to be censored because had access to a lot of top secret information. And you're right, he did win the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the Manhattan Project. And after he passed away some years later, a group of journalists went to the Times and said, you need to give that back. And they said, absolutely not.
Go ahead, Chris.
No, I was just saying, one of the things that we've been talking about, all of these major decision makers and, brains the size of pickup trucks and what. But one of the things I love so much in the book, and that really strikes me, is that they're all just human beings. The ordinary things. You talk about Mrs. Truman saying, well, Harry just called me and he only calls me after something's already happened. Or the one I love, because I go to Tinian once a year, is Deke Parsons squeezing himself into this bomb bay. So you've got, the most technologically advanced weapon in human history. All these scientists, they've created this thing. And at the end, it's one guy with some baling wire and a pair of pliers squeezes himself into this plane to try to get and that's one of the fascinating things. So are there, I don't know, kind of those little anecdotes or those little stories about people that really struck you?
I absolutely agree. And again, you don't know those stories I'm not going to call myself as a historian, a guy who wrote a history book. You don't know a lot of those at the beginning. And that's, look, writing a history book isn't easy. And there were certainly points when I thought, I got a day job. Why the hell am I doing this? But then you'd get enough of those nuggets that you would just sit there and say, this is the best thing in the world. You couldn't, if you were making it up, you couldn't write this. Right. And you're exactly right. It's the day before. It's August 5th of 45. And they suddenly are thinking, because it's a long runway, but it's a heavy plane, the Enola Gay, and the bomb was about the little boy, which was what they called the bomb on Hiroshima, Fat Man, the bomb on Nagasaki. Little boy, I think it was 9,000 pounds, and there suddenly is concern that it might not make it off the runway. In fact, a number of B-29s didn't make it off the runway and crash. But now you're thinking of an armed atomic bomb crashing, which might blow up all of Tinian Island, which was really just a giant staging platform. And I want to hear from you, Chris, what it's like, because it sounds
It's amazing.
like it's pretty godforsaken. But in any case, there's the concern about having a live atomic bomb in the Enola Gay.
Yeah, that's awkward if it goes off.
So they decide, this is the day before. They say, well, we won't arm it until we're actually on the mission, which I think was 6 or 7 hours to get to Hiroshima. And then they say to Deke Parsons, who's the chief weapons officer, well, can you arm it? And he says, well, I never have, but I guess I'll learn. And he literally goes into the bomb bay of they have put little boy in the bomb bay of the plane. And the day before, and it's about 100 degrees, it's in the South Pacific in the middle of the summer. They are, he's sitting there sweating. He's got another guy, and they're sitting there trying to figure out how to arm it. And at the end of it, he says, yeah, I can do this. And in fact, they go off with the plane on August 6th, not armed. And he then sits there and arms the bomb. If that hadn't happened, if something had gone wrong, they would have had to turn around and not dropped it on August 6th. And then it would have been the story of the 117 days that tanks would work.
Well, it's very funny when you go to Tinian. It's one of these places where it's in the middle of nowhere, it's South Pacific. You fly into it because you can't take a boat there, but you just feel the history just like weighs down on you, and it is very hot.
Now, is there much left there? I mean, are they?
Oh yeah, the bomb pits are there. When we go, we basically follow the route that the bomb took, or the components took from the Indianapolis up to the assembly shed. We go to the site of the assembly shed. You can see all the airfields. And then we basically follow Enola Gay backing up to where they loaded the bomb up, where Deke Parsons crawled up into the bomb bay. And you just, the whole time you're telling the story, you can just feel the history. But one of the funniest stories that I got, Don Farrell is our local guy there, and he takes you to where they actually assembled the bits. And apparently it was the one air-conditioned building anywhere in the South Pacific. So you have people like Parsons and all these other people that are on the mission coming up with any excuse they can find to check that vital last thing. It's in this building. And
I didn't know they had air conditioning in 1945. It's interesting because when Truman is at Potsdam, it was a really hot summer in Germany, and they were right on a lake, Lake Reednitz, I think it's pronounced. And because it's so damn hot and there's no air conditioning, you have to open the windows. And as a result, the mosquitoes come in, and as Truman says in his diary, they gave everybody a real working over, which is another reason he couldn't sleep at night.
Well, you're I guess one-time colleague, but certainly David Brinkley wrote a tremendous book about wartime Washington, in which he posited that they did in fact put air conditioning in the Capitol in the 1930s, and he basically posited that this was the end of the Republic, because now Congress would want to be in session year-round instead of going home for 6 months, and so only disaster would ensue after that. So that's basically part of his. I can't remember do you remember the title of that book, Chris Anderson?
No, it's a history. I know.
It's a fabulous.
Washington at War or something.
Yeah, something like that.
It's fabulous.
I have to say, calling him my colleague. Yes, I did work with him at NBC, but it's. I didn't feel we were colleagues. He was. I have to actually say, he was one of the few people in this business, because reporters, we're kind of cheeky, and I've covered presidents. I've covered kings. I've been virtually everywhere, Moscow, China, a lot. Anyway, David Brinkley was one of the few people I was genuinely intimidated by, because it was just, he sort of talked to him like this. I'm sure a lot of the audience doesn't know who we're even talking about, but
former NBC news anchor. I think our audience is of an age that they do.
David Brinkley. But yes, I was kind of intimidated by David Brinkley, and I thought he'd sort of, I always had the feeling I'd walk out and he'd kind of turn to somebody and go, "Who the hell was that?"
I without telling the whole story, I interviewed David Brinkley at 1 a.m. on the last night of the 1976 Democratic Convention in Madison Square Garden.
Yeah.
And I asked him a question about whether, covering the full conventions for 4 nights when nothing going on was more showmanship than journalism. And his response was, that question is so stupid. I don't want to talk to you anymore. And that was the end of the interview.
Well, I never got that, Rick, but I gotta say, it was the fear of getting that.
I went that extra mile, Chris, and I got
during all of my experience with David Brinkley.
So, Rick,
yeah,
some more questions. Or?
Well, we can take one more question from the audience, and then we'll kind of ask our last question and wrap it up. So I thought the MacArthur question was a good one. We had a couple of questions about General MacArthur, and this one from Brian. When was MacArthur informed, and what was his view on the Japanese surrender with or without the bomb? Of course, it's always difficult to know what MacArthur's view is because he sometimes couches it in such prose that it could go a number of different directions. But what's your take on that?
He and Eisenhower were the two people who were most against dropping the bomb, and I think he felt, as Eisenhower did, that it was that the Japanese would surrender without it. They didn't need to do it, and that it would shock the conscience of the world, which is interesting when you think about him eventually dropping the atom bomb on the Chinese in the Korean War. MacArthur plays a role in the after August 6th because he, of course, is made the head of the occupation of Japan. And one of the stories you talked about that Americans didn't know, there was a very concerted effort of public relations after the dropping of the bomb. What the American people were told and what they weren't told. What they were told, and William Lawrence participated in this, was they were told about all of the brilliance and the difficulty and the extraordinary teamwork behind the project. What they weren't told, and really to a remarkable degree, was what had happened to the people on the ground in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there was strict censorship of anybody who went in to on the ground, ground zero in either of those locations. And the American census would simply confiscate any pictures that were taken. Even a Japanese couple who drew paintings of the destruction of Hiroshima, their paintings were confiscated, which leads to one final great journalistic story, which was that in 1946, the legendary editor of the New Yorker, William Shawn, thought this is a great untold story. I mean, here it is. This is the bomb that ended the war. We really don't know what happened. So he commissioned a war correspondent named John Hersey to go in. And Hersey didn't fly into Tokyo, as most of the Western reporters did, where he would immediately fall under the control of American censors. He came in from China and to get there. So he evaded that and got on the ground in Hiroshima and spent weeks there interviewing, first of all, seeing firsthand the destruction and interviewing survivors, and then went back. Yeah. And that's the Peace Dome now. It was just an office building in Hiroshima, and that, the framework of that dome is now, I guess, the iconic symbol of Hiroshima. And he came back and wrote his story, and Shawn realized what he had, and he convinced the publishers or the people in charge of the New Yorker to give the entire issue over. It sold 300,000 copies, and then that was, I believe, in August of 46, and then later that year, before the end of 46, it was a book, and it sold 3 million copies. And if you haven't read it and you want some sense of it, it's one of the great pieces of reporting, and really was the first look that Americans got at what they had done in Hiroshima, and it's Hiroshima by John Hersey. All right, he's done it again, Rick.
I know. Fire him. They should fire me. But
Or your technician.
Chris Anderson, why don't you ask the last question here?
One of the things that I think is to your credit is that you tell both sides of the story, and you talk a little bit about a young woman named Tamura.
Hideko Tamura.
Yep. And if you could kind of maybe tell a little bit about why you brought her into the story, a little bit about her, and then during my prep for this, you talk about taking her to see the Enola Gay, and I thought that was very moving, and I thought maybe you could share some of that.
Yeah. So one of the things, it's so interesting, the history here is, yes, it's history, and yet 75 years ago, and obviously all the adults are gone. The flight crew of the Enola Gay is gone. All the people in Truman's work habitat, all the people at Los Alamos. But there are a few people who are still alive. And one of them was that young lady. She was 10 years old at the time, Hideko Tamura. And it's a fascinating story. She has written a lot about it. And so we were able to research and find not only that she gave a first-person account of what happened, but in fact she was still alive. She ended up emigrating to the U.S. and getting married and lives now. She's in her mid-80s in Bend, Oregon. So I'll try to. I know we want to wrap up here. Briefly, she was 10 years old. Her family sent her out to the countryside because a lot of families did that with their children. Now, one of the reasons that they hit Hiroshima was it had never been touched during the war, and they wanted a place unlike Tokyo that had never been touched so that people would understand the full devastation of this one bomb. So she was sent out to the countryside as her parents were worried about it. She hated. She was sent to what was supposed to be like a boarding school, but it turned out really to be more of a work camp. And she smuggled a letter to her mother and said, "Get me out of here." Her mother comes to rescue her in August and says, we get these air raids, even though we haven't had actual strikes. We get air raids every night and you can't sleep. Why don't we stay here in the countryside for a few days? And Hideko, who was a very willful 10-year-old, says, "No, I want to go home." So she makes her mother take her home. The day she takes her home is August 5th, which means that she is there on August 6th when the bomb is dropped. Her mother had gone out to do some civil defense work and was incinerated in the explosion. Hideko was in her home with members of the family, but she's in her own bedroom. Her mother had prepared her for what to do if there should be a regular firebombing, obviously not for an atom bomb. And she'd said, if you get the sense of a bomb, get under a big piece of furniture or stand at a doorway. And so that, because one of the first things that's going to happen is the building, your home, will collapse around you, and that's the way you can die. In fact, it did collapse on top of her, but one of her aunts came and dug her out. And then her mother said, and as soon as you get out, go to the river. The Ota River runs right through the center of Hiroshima because there will be explosions and fires, and the river, you'll be safe. And her family was kind of paralyzed in shock after the explosion. So this little 10-year-old girl goes off by herself, sees these horrific sights, which are just out of Dante's Inferno, but ends up saving herself in the river, is reconnected with her family. The picture you saw of her before, she was 17. But the one last interesting point is that you would think that the people who survived the bombing, they were called the Hibakusha, would have been heroes. No, they were actually kind of pariahs, because one, there was a concern that they were ill, so nobody wanted to hire them for jobs because of the long-lasting effects of radiation, and nobody wanted to marry the young girls, who were now women, because they were concerned about birth defects. So in the end, she ends up going to the United States, going to Worcester College in Ohio, marrying an American, getting married, and she's a peace activist. Just final postscript, I promise. So we did a documentary for Fox News about the book, and I wanted her, all the conversations that happened over the phone, but I said, could you come fly to Washington for this interview? And she agreed to. And then she said, and this is again one of those cases where truth is stranger than fiction, she said, I want to do one thing. And what? And she said, I want to go see the Enola Gay. I want to see the plane that dropped the bomb that destroyed my city. I never would have dreamt of it, but we did go, and it was a deeply moving moment. She was prayerful. She was angry, but not bitter. And she looked at it, and she said a prayer for peace. And then she said, I think that plane is an old man, and he needs to be put to sleep. And that's the end of my story.
Wow. What a moment. Chris Wallace, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour. And I just want to remind everybody that your book is Countdown 1945, The Extraordinary Story of the Atomic Bomb and the 116 Days That Changed the World. I can barely read that type because I have tears in my eyes. That's an amazing story. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, guys. This has been a pleasure. I have to say, it really, I'm sort of like, 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. This was fun.
So it wasn't as bad as you thought it would be.
You're great interviewers, and as you can tell, I'm very enthused about this story, and I love sharing it with.
Well, you should got to go to Tinian, Chris.
I will make that happen. We got to get rid of COVID first.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a problem.
All right, Chris, take care.
Thank you, guys, and thank all of you out there.
Thank you.
What an amazing story.
Yeah.
She wanted to see the Enola Gay. That blows me away. Chris, I mentioned this at the top of the show. We still have many people here, but I do want to mention again, it is a special day for you because it is your birthday.
Oh,
and
yeah.
so we want to say a cake for you. Happy birthday, Chris Anderson.
Oh, thank you,
I think that's one candle for every 10 years. I'm not sure, but anyway, it's I'm sure it's a wonderful occasion for you, and I hope you've enjoyed it today. And next week we have World War II, but in another direction.
Yep.
We have a book and an author, Catherine Grace Katz, who's written a new book called Daughters of Yalta that's getting a lot of attention about the daughters of Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Averell Harriman, who are all at the Yalta Summit. So that should be interesting and different and unusual.
Yes. Sounds
and
good.
So
Stay safe, everybody.
I guess we're done. Yes.
Stay safe, everybody. Thanks for joining us.